So this is going to be a quick video on how to remove and replace the ignition cylinder and ignition switch in a 2010 Dodge Avenger. I first did this because my key was binding in the ignition here and I couldn't get the ignition cylinder to turn, so I took it apart, disassembled it, lubricated everything nicely, and then that solved that problem, but then the car wouldn't start. So since I'm going in there again, I thought I'd make a quick video showing the tricks to getting this thing apart for those who end up with this problem. I hate working on this car. I was hoping the old lady would wreck it or it would get stolen or something by now, but no luck. So the first thing I would do is just disconnect the negative lead on the battery. So that was right here. It's a 15mm nut. Just get that out of the way, just because we're going to be working with the immobilizer and stuff, and I don't want to trip that. And then the next thing you have to do, there's a couple plastic panels here that need to come apart. They go really easily. So there was one, just a plastic panel here that comes back, and then you'll have a metal plate under here that mounts with those two on that side and those two on that side, Torx 20 screws. You can undo those pretty easily, and then that metal plate just comes right out. So get those out of the way. And then over here on this side, I peeled back the weather stripping so that you can get these side panels out really easily. These are just held on with clips, and then there's one down here, and I got this one down here out of the way as well. I don't remember if that even ended up being necessary. And then what that does is allows you to access that Torx screw and that one right there for taking this center console piece off. And then the other thing you have to do is they're loose now because I already undid them, but there's 3 T20 screws underneath holding your trim underneath the steering column. So go ahead and undo those, get that out of the way. So let me do that real quick. So now with those screws undone, the other thing you have to do is pry up on the trim here. One of these blue plastic pry tools works really great. I got that one for like $7 in a set from Harbor Freight, but you can find them online or wherever you want. So pull that trim off, and then this one needs to go as well. There's not really anything besides clips holding it in place, but this will make your life a lot easier when you get to the point of having to get the ignition cylinder loose. So I just kind of pry and try not to break it. Let me get all that out of the way. Okay, once you have that trim panel out, the radio is just held in with 4 Torx screws, and you can undo those so that you'll be able to slide it out and unplug the 3 connectors on the back. And then this trim panel just pops right forward. And that needs to go as well. Here we go. It's just held in with a couple clips. The first time I did this, I managed to not break any clips. We'll see if I continue that spree. There we go. All right, I think that's loosened. Okay, now with that trim piece removed, you need to get this one out of here. So I've already undone the screws on that side, so that part comes loose. And then down here, there's this little plastic connector holding a couple body panels. I just loosened that up. And then you kind of have to shimmy it out of what it's connected to all down here. I'm not actually going to totally remove this piece, but you do have to get it pretty loosened up to get it out of your way. Let me get that screw out of here real quick. That in a second. And so you can see here it's wedged in between these 2 panels, so it just takes a little bit of work to get her loose. All right, that's all it is. You just got to loosen her up, and then this piece up here just pulls right out. What am I missing here? There's nothing to this one. It's held in place to that trim panel on those bottom clips. So once you pop that out, this piece should go pretty easily. There we go. All right, so now with that out of the way, you can kind of see what we're working at. So this is loosened up. Here's your ignition cylinder, and there's 3 screws holding it in place. There's number 1, way back here by the instrument cluster. The first time I did this, I loosened up the instrument cluster. We'll see if it's possible to do without. And then the other 2 are right here. There's number 1, and number 2 is kind of hidden behind this piece of trim next to the radio. So you can see why I suggest removing the radio to help you get a little bit of mobility here. It doesn't take long to do anyway. So let me get the radio out of the way real quick, and then I'll show you how I undo these screws. So I checked, and actually to get at the third screw holding the ignition cylinder in place way back here, you do have to remove the instrument cluster. So what I did is I dropped the steering wheel all the way down, got myself a really long extension on my T20 driver, and then undid screw number 1 and screw number 2. And then this thing will tilt forward. You can kind of wedge it out from around these clips to undo the 4 electrical connectors on the back. Okay, so with that cluster out of the way, you will be able to reach that third screw back there. You will, however, need some kind of right angle tool to get at it. I have this thing from Harbor Freight from like 15 years ago that just works like a ratchet with a Torx bit and an extension. And then the ones on the front, you'll be able to manipulate the trim around to get at. There's one, and the other one under here. After popping this trim piece a little bit loose, with 2 hands, I'll be able to pretty easily wedge in there and get to her. So let me undo those 3 screws, and then I'll show you the really tricky stuff. The other thing that you need to do at this point in order to get access to where we're going to be working a little bit better is disconnect the button for the hood release or the trunk release from its connector. So the connector looks like this, and this little lip catches on a square back here, right there. Hold on, let me see if I can get it to focus. Basically, you have to use a screwdriver right here to lift up on this tab a little bit in order to get this to slide out. It was rather difficult. Alright, so now that I've got this nicely mobilized, I can slide this all the way down like that and hold it in place with my knee and work a little bit better. So you can see the cylinder here, in my case, is loosened up and nice and easy to remove. And then back here, yours is going to look a little bit different because I have already done something. So that right there is the immobilizer, I think, with a screw holding it onto the ignition cylinder. Okay, so now that we're at this point, you can easily manipulate this out of your way if you need to get at those screws, and for the next step, which is kind of a struggle. So right here, yours is going to look a little bit different because I've already done this once and decided not to reassemble it like it came from the factory because it was exceedingly painful. Yours is going to have this little white piece of plastic mounted back in here. This hole is for a T20 screw that goes right there. And then the ignition cylinder, which you can see right there, you see that little tab on top? That tab slides into right here and locks back in there. So basically, you need to pry up on this and slide the ignition cylinder back. But you don't have enough mobility to do that because the immobilizer has this little tab right here in the front of it. You can kind of see that right there. It's got its own tab right there. So basically that tab that you're looking at right here prevents you from being able to slide the ignition cylinder back far enough to unlock it. It hits right here. So basically it's took me about 2 hours to figure out. What you need to do is lift up on that tab and kind of pull the immobilizer antenna or whatever this is called forward and off out of your way, and then that way you can wedge a screwdriver kind of up over that metal tab back there and pull up on this little bit of plastic and get this out of the way. And then once you've done that, the ignition cylinder is only held in with a couple plugs and you can pop it backwards and get her out of the way. No problem. I decided that this thing probably is not important enough to make this a struggle to put back together, or if I ever had to deal with it again, I would not want to. And from what I can tell, it doesn't seem to do anything important, so I'm just going to leave it out. Now that all that is loosened up, I can simply reach up underneath here and fish that ignition cylinder out of here, like so, and undo the connections. So there's a plug for the immobilizer, and then there's a plug for the ignition switch. This one's a little tricky. It has like this little red slider on it that you first have to slide, and then it's got the usual button that you depress to pop her off. And then there's another plug right here. I think this is like a neutral lockout or something. Or something to do with what gear it's in, from what I could figure out. I think it prevents you from taking the key out if it's not in drive. So to get that out, I put the key in, I put it to the run position, and then there's a tab on the back side of this thing that I just push down on, and this thing pulls out pretty easily. So I'll do that real quick. Okay, so now that I have this ignition cylinder out, you can kind of see what we're dealing with. So if you need to remove the ignition key cylinder, the lock part itself, what you do is pretty simple. You are not going to be able to see it here because of the lighting. Maybe if I turn on the flash, but probably not. Yeah, you kind of can. Right there in that hole, you can kind of see a pin. So if you press down on that pin, this whole locking assembly will pull out, and then you can push out and lubricate or copy, if you need to just install a new one, the tumblers. There's other videos that are probably better than one I could make that walk you through that process if that's the route you go. I just took mine apart, cleaned it really nicely, lubricated it with some graphite, and that did the trick. And then at this point, taking the ignition switch off is trivial. It's just that gold T20 screw, and pop it off. I did read online that you should have the key in the run position when you're doing this, so make sure you do that. Otherwise you risk damaging the switch itself. At this point you should be able to take this all apart and put it back together and get your car started again. In my case, I could not figure out for the life of me what was causing me to be unable to start the car. The key was turning freely, but the dashboard would light up after I had everything reassembled, but the car would not start. So I thought it was the ignition switch, so I bought a AutoZone ignition switch, which was this one, which I actually could not get mounted. So for those of you who have a bad ignition switch, don't get this one, at least this part number from AutoZone. And if you look in closely, you can see where somebody before me clearly struggled a lot harder than I did trying to mash the actuator in. Once I saw that damage and it didn't go together pretty easily, I realized that probably wasn't the right one, so I went to Advanced Auto and got this part number, and I won't take it out, but actually it fit just fine, and I put it all back together. And then I could get it started with this ignition switch, or I could not get it started still with this ignition switch. So I went down a rabbit hole after everything was put together, and talked to a clever friend of mine who suggested I check fuses, and I didn't think I would have blown a fuse, but I started going through here checking fuses at random, and lo and behold, I found a bad fuse. So the number 4 position fuse right there, so the third small one up is that little 10 amp fuse that's upside down, and that is a fuse for the ignition switch. So that one was blown. I suspect what happened is when I sprayed a bunch of that graphite lubricant down the cylinder, some of it got into the ignition switch and caused a short circuit. But I'll show you once I get all this back together, the car will start. I suggest plugging everything in here and putting the cluster back in place and plugging everything in and trying to start the vehicle before going and putting the dash back together. But there we go. And then I'm just gonna put that back in there, keep that white piece out, put the 3 screws in, and I'm done finally. The car lives another day. My girlfriend was upset that I got it running because she was already looking at listings for new vehicles. But we'll kick that can down the road, hopefully as long as possible. One last thing, just don't forget to reconnect the connector for the trunk release button.